And I welcome Mr. Mike Quigley. Information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses and evidence has been provided to you. For the Hansard record, could you please state your name and the capacity in which you appear?
My name is Michael Patrick Quigley, and I'm in fact retired, but was the previous CEO, actually previous before last, the first CEO of NBN Co.
Well, you're welcome here today. Now, I understand you haven't lodged a written submission to the committee as part of this inquiry, but you do have an opening statement that you'd like to make.
Yes, if I could go through.
Of course.
Some points.
We'll move to questions after that.
Okay. So, Chair and members of the committee, thank you for the invitation to attend today's public hearing. Having led the NBN Co for its first 4 years, I fervently wish to see NBN Co succeed in building an asset of long-term value for all Australians. So I appreciate the opportunity to provide an input to the committee on the challenges, particularly the financial challenges, that NBN Co now faces. Those challenges are largely a consequence of the unfortunate policy decisions in September 2013. But first I'd like to remind us all that since July 2009, the employees of NBN Co have done a remarkable job. They built an operating company and a functioning network from a standing start. Now, in my written submission, I've detailed some of the things that they achieved over the last 9 years. It's been a mix of people, but they have achieved a great deal, and I think the employees of NBN Co can be proud of what they have achieved. It's a great pity for the country that in the last 5 years, much of the effort has been directed towards building an access network which has very significant limitations, most particularly around the inclusion of FTTN. Even the UK, which was often referred as a pragmatic model for FTTN, has now recognised, like most other countries around the world, that the future of broadband is based on deep fibre deployment. In its recent Future Telecoms Infrastructure Review, the UK has set targets of 15 million FTTP premises by 2025. When commenting on this review, the UK market analysis firm Broadband Trends said in its July 2018 research note, and I quote, "Imagine where the UK would be today if it had chosen FTTH, that's fibre to the home, from the start rather than G.fast for its super fast broadband program. Although it will be able to leverage some of that work for its full fibre ambitions, many of the costs associated with it could have been better spent on fibre to the home." End of quote. G.fast is an FTTN and FTTC technology, and so Broadband Trends is effectively saying that the UK would have been better off focusing on fibre to the home from the start. Here in Australia, the policy decisions made in September 2013, which mandated the use of existing copper and pay TV cable technologies, have created very significant financial problems for NBN Co. In their most recent corporate plan, NBN Co reported that the estimated time to achieve positive cash flow has slipped out by a year to fiscal year 22, and peak funding will increase from 49 billion to 51 billion. That's a continuation of the trend from 2013, when the starting point was 29.5 billion. On current projections, the network build will be complete by 2020. From that time, the ongoing cash flow will be largely a function of revenue and operating costs, with interest costs and subscriber payments playing a part. The potential to generate revenue and reduce operating costs has regrettably been degraded by the move to the MTM. So the achievement of a satisfactory positive cash flow and long-term financial viability will be significant challenges for NBN Co. Revenue is determined largely by the take-up rate and the average revenue per user, or ARPU. Both will be lower on the MTM than on the FTTP network. The reasons are fairly obvious. Performance of the FTTN service is limited in terms of speed and reliability. End users who are prepared to pay more for a higher capability service don't have that option with FTTN. The same is true, but to a lesser extent, for HFC, FTTB and FTTC. NBN Co's product documentation reflects the reality that these copper-based products simply cannot provide the same capability as fibre to the premise. And even more important for revenue generation, they are less predictable. This contributes to an unsatisfactory situation for retail service providers and for end users. The same NBN Co product documentation makes clear that when a retail service provider orders one of the FTTP access products, they will get what they have ordered. The known and predictable speed performance, combined with the high reliability of FTTP, makes its revenue generation capability, both in terms of take-up rates and ARPU, considerably better than that of the MTM. The other side of the cash flow coin is the operating costs. It is usually a telco's OPEX, not its CAPEX, that determines its ongoing cash flow performance. Every operating telco in the world is constantly striving to reduce operating costs by simplifying its product set and associated processes. However, managing multiple technologies, FTTP, FTTN, FTTC, FTTB and HFC, rather than just FTTP, increases the complexity and costs of the IT systems, the maintenance cost, the spares holding costs, the training costs and the overhead costs. The renegotiated Telstra deal has also increased NBN Co's costs. Responsibility to make Telstra's PIT and duct infrastructure fit for purpose has been transferred with the MTM to NBN Co. Little wonder that the CEO of Telstra said the renegotiated deal was undoubtedly better for Telstra shareholders. There are now no easy solutions to these revenue and OPEX challenges and the impact they're going to have on the ability of NBN Co to generate a satisfactory free cash flow. The NBN Co senior management, the board and the shareholder cannot recover the cash already spent on the MTM implementation. Contrary to conventional wisdom, the latest Australian Bureau of Statistics data shows that as at June 2018, fixed networks represent 96.8% of data downloaded, with 3.2% being on mobile networks. This is why most telecom experts continue to hold the view that both fixed and mobile broadband networks will continue to be needed into the future, and many see the potential for converged networks with shared infrastructure. However, not all fixed network configurations have the same opportunity to play a complementary role in the deployment of 5G. All telcos understand that full fibre infrastructure is vital to underpin 5G coverage. That complementary role was anticipated when the original corporate plan for the fibre to the premise based NBN was developed. If the deep fibre FTTP network, which was at the heart of the original NBN, had been allowed to continue, NBN Co would now be much better placed to participate in the 5G deployments, potentially generating another important wholesale revenue stream. With the MTM using the old copper infrastructure, this revenue opportunity has evaporated. The move to the MTM has turned 5G from a potential opportunity for NBN Co into a competitive threat. The financial problems now facing NBN Co would have been manageable if the 2013 estimates for the provision of NBN service to all premises by 2016 and peak funding of $29.5 billion had been even close to reality. But the original MTM estimates were completely wrong. The $29.5 billion is currently $51 billion, and the delivery of NBN services to every premise is now projected to be 2020, not 2016 as originally promised. Given these massive increases in MTM costs and blowouts in timing, it was presumably inevitable, but still unconscionable, that inaccurate claims will be made regarding the costs and timing of the FTT NBN. The original estimate of the peak funding costs of the FTT-based NBN was $43 billion, and the final estimate, made in September 2013, just before the change of government, was $45 billion. The build was projected to be complete by the end of 2021. We regularly hear that the original FTT NBN would have needed $30 billion more and would have taken 6 to 8 years longer than the NTM. That claim is asserting that the original NBN would have required peak funding of $80 billion and would have been completed in 2027. However, Mr Morrow confirmed in a Senate estimate hearing in October 2015 that this estimate was not for the continuation of the original FTTP plan, but rather for a restart of FTTP after 2 years of investments in, commitments to and delays with the MTM. No reasonable person can accept this as a credible scenario. Nevertheless, this sleight of hand is still used to distract attention away from any criticisms of the MTM costs and timing increases. In a further attempt to discredit the former FTTP deployment, the cost per premise is still quoted by NBN Co to be $4,400, and they project that this will be the cost at the end of the build period. In other words, they have assumed no reduction in FTTP cost per premise for the life of the build, despite a raft of new, cheaper FTTP technology becoming available. In its September 2013 estimate of $45 billion in peak funding, the management of NBN Co, of which I was a part, assumed a reduction of 25 to 30% in the per-premise costs of FTTP over the life of the project. Subsequent data has shown that we were rather conservative in that estimate. Chorus in New Zealand achieved a reduction of 44% in their FTTP costs in the 3 years from FY14 to 16. Many overseas telcos have reported similar percentage decreases in FTTP costs. But yet, in its estimates, the current management of NBN Co assumes no FTTP cost reductions would be achievable from 2013 to 2020. Overseas experience shows the claims regarding the FTTP costs and timing have no credibility. It's taken several years for a clearer picture to emerge, but we now know the decision to change to the MTM was thoroughly flawed, and the network performance and NBN Co's financials demonstrate this. The MTM is a network that costs more and, regrettably, does less. The technical and business logic behind the decision taken in 2013 is, to say the least, puzzling. That decision will end up costing the Australian taxpayer many billions of dollars in lost revenue, in higher CapEx and OPEX costs, and in the inevitable upgrade to a deep fibre network to meet Australia's long-term broadband needs. Looking to the future, it will be a task of government working with NBN Co to make the best possible decisions in the public interest. It will require an honest appraisal of the issues, careful analysis, consultation and a degree of patience to find the best path forward. Thanks for your time, and I'd welcome any questions.
Thank you, Mr Quigley. I will start with just a couple of questions and then go to other members of the committee. Looking forward, and as someone who's obviously got an enormous amount of involvement and expertise in this space, what are, in your view, the key risks and benefits of the government continuing with the present intention to sell the NBN Co, as compared to the risks and benefits of essentially realising that that's not really viable and keeping NBN Co in public ownership?
Well, I have to say, I think, and I always have thought the case that keeping NBN Co in public ownership was probably the best move. It was a monopoly wholesale provider, and while monopolies, people have concerns about them, which is why the ACCC needs to be involved. Selling monopoly off to private interests, I'm not sure would be a good move. I also think that this is a network that should have been built and operated for the public good. I really do believe that broadband, the provision of broadband to all Australians, is going to become more and more important in the future, like as proverbial water and sewerage and electricity. Therefore, to have it as a service that, especially in a country like Australia, I think it's a service that needs to be provided by a government.
Do you think, we've heard this morning from the Department of Finance and Communication, there's a lot of consideration in the public domain as well around the sort of the valuation of the NBN looking ahead towards a possible sale. Do you think, based on what you've read and your experience within the sector, and obviously once upon a time NBN Co itself, there's any basis on which a sale at or around $50 billion could be achieved?
That will depend, I think, crucially on when somebody goes to look at the value of a company. And I was involved in past life, especially overseas, in doing acquisitions and valuing companies. You look very strongly at cash flow, which is why I've emphasised this morning in my opening statement the importance of cash flow. If a potential acquirer of the NBN cannot convince themselves that there is going to be a strong positive cash flow, then they're obviously going to pay a lot less for the NBN. So generating cash is, I think, a real imperative for NBN Co for a variety of reasons, for its own long-term financial viability and to generate enough cash to be able to be constantly upgrading the network, which the network that's now been built clearly needs to be upgraded in the not too distant future. So I think it'd be a pretty tough call for anybody to come in now and value the NBN at $50 billion as an acquirer, unless they have access to a lot of other data about how things are going to progress.
Obviously where we are now started with the privatisation of Telstra in the 90s. There's some suggestion that, one of the sort of the more likely purchasers of the NBN Co, at least in part, may well be Telstra again, and people have made reference to the sort of scenario involving Kerry Packer and Alan Bond, when Kerry sold assets to Bond and then bought them back at a kind of ridiculous discount. And some people have made reference to that and suggesting, as Kerry Packer once said, you only get one Alan Bond in your lifetime, that Telstra may well find itself rubbing its hands as it sort of repurchases aspects of the NBN Co in future. Do you think that's a sort of a realistic prospect?
That's very difficult to tell. I would say that for Telstra to reacquire or to acquire NBN Co would put us back in a situation from a competitive industry standpoint that we were in quite a long time ago, and that NBN Co was created to try and solve in part. And not only just provide ubiquitous broadband to Australian citizens, but also to restructure the telecom industry. So I think, frankly, that would be a move that would have to be looked at very, very carefully. And I see no reason, by the way, in having run both a publicly listed company in overseas and a government business enterprise, there is fundamentally absolutely no reason why a government business enterprise cannot run as efficiently and effectively as a publicly listed company. There is no reason for that. So I see no solution. I see no reason why Telstra taking on the NBN Co would necessarily produce a better solution for the Australian public.
No, fair enough. All right, I'll just ask one more question, then I'll move to Senator Hume next. Yeah. You mentioned an interesting kind of ubiquity. I mean, we've heard previously that if you want a sort of a broadband foundation that works best, that serves the community best, you need to have ubiquity. You need to have a sort of an evenness of service quality across, not just from a point of view of fairness and digital equality, but in fact, all of the sort of projected economic, social and other benefits really depend on there being that consistency. If you don't have that consistency, how can a person providing a service through digital means do so efficiently when they might be servicing one person who has fibre to the premise and another person who has relatively low quality fibre to the node? But the aspect of ubiquity you kind of mentioned was actually in relation to operating costs, that by choosing an MTM, multi-technology mix, it actually means that the NBN Co has to sort of operate from a maintenance and upgrade and service point of view across all of these different technologies, which in itself is costly. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yes, it is something that I certainly learned in close to 40 years in the telco industry, that telcos are always trying to simplify their product base. And they're doing that for a variety of reasons. Often it's driven by to try and get their IT costs down, because often in big established telcos, making changes to IT is the bottleneck to rolling out any new type of service. So when you use multiple technologies, you put up costs right across the company. You put up costs in IT, you put up costs in maintenance, spares, holding, you name it. But you also make it a little more complex for people as a wholesaler. It make more complex for people who coming on to retail products, because now they're dealing with different types of products, particularly when those products, the performance of which is a little unpredictable. And that is the case on the old copper technologies. FTTN, you'll see that in the product documentation I mentioned. If you go to order a service that's, for example, 50 megs, what you'll get committed to is a range. Even for 100 megs, what you get is a range. So it really does, having a variety of products rather than one uniform product that's frankly completely future-proof in the sense that it's got almost unlimited capacity and unlimited speeds available to it in the future. You don't have that situation, so the retailers are constantly having to juggle with which area's got what and what can I sell. That puts everybody's costs up.
Okay, thank you. Senator Hume?
Thank you, Chair. Can I ask first about if average speeds on fibre to the node is around 65 megabits per second, isn't that a good service for people that are on ADSL?
Compared to ADSL2?
Yes.
Yes, certainly. It's a much better service than you could get on ADSL2.
Yes. So if that's the case, is it your contention then that those people should have waited longer for a fibre to the premise network, even though they had extraordinarily poor services?
Well, the problem is, Senator, that not everybody can get the higher speeds. And by the way, there's no doubt that the closer you push fibre to the home, which is why NBN Co is moving towards fibre to the curb, the closer they push that fibre, the better the speeds will get. And the problem is people's homes are a range of distances away from the node. So some people will get 65 megabits per second. Others may be, frankly, just above 25 megabits per second. And I have heard of experiences of people who've been below 25 megabits per second on FTTN. So the problem is it is unpredictable. If everybody was getting 65 megabits per second, you could say, okay, that's a reasonable service at this point in time. But the reality is not everybody does get 65 megabits per second.
So it's, I mean, I don't think it's a contentious issue. I think it's a sort of statement of fact to say that it would have taken so much longer to build fibre to the premise network. Is it justifiable then to say that NBN would be more susceptible to competition if it was still 7 years from completion?
It's not 7 years. It would not have been at this point in time 7 years from completion. Every telco network I've built over many, many years, they always start slowly. Mm-hmm. And then they speed up, and often is the case that they end up, the volume rollouts go faster than people had planned it originally. That was the case with the future mode of operation, which we built for Telstra. It was the case with the submarine fibre, optical fibre cable plant that we had in Port Botany. In the rollout of AT&T's FTTN network, they always start more slowly and then they speed up. If you actually look at the curves to show how the rollout speed of FTTP was growing, it was growing at quite a rate. What caused a hiccup was the asbestos issue that happened, and then there was an election, so of course the FTTP stopped. I spoke recently to one of the senior people in the construction companies who was working with NBN Co in 2013, and they said to me, Mike, we were on the very cusp of breaking through, both in terms of costs and solving the problems that allow us to really speed up the rollout. So I don't accept the premise that it would have taken much longer to do FTTP, and when you look at the rollouts around the world, there is no reason why it should have taken much longer than a MTM. Now, I grant you that if the MTM had have got to every premise in Australia by 2016, that would have been faster than you could do FTTP. But they didn't, and they couldn't. So
can I just ask, your evidence is that the network could have been built for 45 billion, is that
Yes, that's correct.
So my understanding is in 2013, there was a dispute that was going on with some of your delivery partners, and in particular VPL, I think is the one that I'm thinking of. And my understanding was that that was because the rates that you were forcing them onto to meet your cost targets weren't sufficient for them to make any money. Is that right?
No, that's not correct. It's in all of these big buildings. Once again, I'm leaning on experience I've had in lots of different places in the world, including Australia. At the beginning of these projects, there's always a settling down period in which there's a challenge between the supplier of a service and the buyer of the service. it's probably no surprise to you that the construction industry will always say the rates aren't high enough. We had a good hard look at what was going on in the field. In many cases, the construction companies were having some difficulties because they hadn't got all their logistics sorted out. They'd have fibre there, but they didn't have approval to open the pavement. They may have approval to open the pavement, but the boring machine was in the next suburb over. So it went on. We were not prepared to pay for those types of mistakes. This was taxpayers' money we were spending, so we made sure we weren't prepared to pay any more than we thought the job would take. Now, it's true that just before the change of government, we had decided to move those costs up a little bit for the construction companies, but they also needed to come to the party as well, which many of them were willing to do. So there is a settling in period in which rates do, in fact, get stabilised. And this isn't theoretical. This is exactly what Chorus has done in New Zealand. This is exactly what Verizon did in the US. Every country in the world has got their costs of fibre to the premise down substantially. In Chorus, they got it down by 44% in 3 years. In Verizon, I think it was 38% in about the same 3 years. So it's a natural evolution of these big construction projects, especially ones in which you're doing the same thing over and over again. This isn't a bridge, a one-off bridge, or a one-off metro. It is a kind of a factory, a distributed factory, where you're doing the same thing all over Australia, repeated times. You have a great opportunity to learn.
So can I just ask, you still contend that you would have completed a full fibre to the premise build by 2021, even though in 2013 there were blowouts in timing and that the build had ground to a halt in a number of states?
No, the build had only ground to a halt because of the asbestos issue that we had. So we had no choice but to stop that.
But do you still contend that fibre to the premise would have been rolled out by 2021?
Yes, I do. And by the way, when we did that last corporate plan, which was submitted as a draft to the government, but wasn't because the government changed, it wasn't accepted, we re-estimated everything. The $45 billion in peak funding costs was our estimate, as was the completion by the end of 2021.
So the urgency of the mission and a combination, and you've said before that you're very conscious of the fact that it was taxpayer dollars, surely then you would agree that a ubiquitous broadband being rolled out sooner and more cost effectively across the entire country is a good thing for end users?
Not if what you're left with is... No, by the way, I agree, that's a good argument to make, and I have to say it was a debatable question when that, if you're talking about the MTM, ubiquitous broadband network, when it was going to be finished, when it was going to reach every subscriber by 2016, and it was going to cost $29.5 billion in peak funding. But it's $51 billion in peak funding, and it's not going to be finished till 2020 if everything goes well.
All right, we might go to Senator Georgiou. I'll come back across this side, and then I'll come to Dr. Gillespie. So,
thank you,
Senator Georgiou.
Thank you, Chair. Has your experience with NBN Co made you believe that major infrastructure projects like this one and others that you've probably worked on, generally are serious risky because they have a tendency to become political?
Yeah. I have to say, I think sometimes that point is overemphasised a little bit. Running, I ran Alcatel's North American business for quite some years, and then was the COO of Alcatel worldwide. And I can tell you, in that job in a publicly listed company, there are enormous pressures that come from all over the place, in quarterly earnings calls, in having to go out and do roadshows. So you have those things in a publicly listed company, which are a constant pressure and distraction on management. You have similar things, slightly different, in a government business enterprise, such as turning up at joint parliamentary committees and Senate estimates, which are important to do for a GBE. They absolutely are essential to do, I think, for an NBN Co or any other GBE. So is it political? Yes, I'd say the thing that I didn't expect with NBN Co was the amount of media attention that it got initially. And some of the statements that were made in the media, frankly, were just simply silly. There was almost an assumption that from the day you started, people were going to have services. It's a bit like saying, well, we're about to dig the first hole for the Sydney Harbour Bridge or the Opera House, and suddenly you're going to have people crossing the bridge. It just doesn't happen. There's an enormous amount of planning and architecture work that has to be done. And then you've got the ramp up, and the ramp up always takes peeling the onion. You are solving one problem after another, and then what happens? The thing takes off. That's what we saw on the transit network. That's what we saw on fixed wireless network. That's what we saw in the greenfields fibre. So we got over those humps. We were about to get over that hump on fibre to the Prem brownfields, but then it stopped.
Right, Mr. Jones.
Thanks very much. I want to go to, I think, the issue around CVC pricing.
CVC pricing, yes.
Yeah, which was designed on your watch.
Yes.
Was originally designed with a view to monetise the massive growth in data consumption, the anticipated growth in
Yes.
data consumption, about 40% per annum, we understand.
Yep.
Given the changes in the technology, the MTM mix, do you think the CVC pricing arrangement is the right structure for today, or should we be looking at a different model?
I think probably the way things have evolved, going towards a bundled, which NBN Co did with its focus on 50, going towards a bundled product is probably not a bad way to go. These things are always, by the way, you can debate, there's advantages, disadvantages one way or the other. What we were attempting to do with the CVC was to give as much flexibility as we possibly could to the retail service provider. In other words, and that was the same was true for the AVC. They could buy a range of speeds, and they could also purchase a range of capacities. So we were giving them the flexibility to decide, did they want to run a high quality service with kind of almost a committed, not quite, but almost a committed information rate over a link at a higher price, or did they want kind of a relatively cheap and cheerful lower capacity link? That was the intention that we were trying to get at. The other thing we tried to do was to pitch the wholesale prices of both the AVC and CVC so that the 25.5 product from NBN Co would be competitive at a retail level with ADSL2+, but obviously far better performing. No ADSL2 Plus service will give you 25 megs down and 5 megs up. So it was a much better service, pitched in the same, round about the same retail level. And we achieved that. That's what happened. Now what happens is speeds, people's demands for speed continue to increase. And we're seeing that all over the world. And it doesn't matter, by the way, in my view, what we think customers want. In the end, they order what they want, and people are ordering overseas very high-speed services. Whether we believe, or even the minister believes, they should or shouldn't have anything above 15 megabits per second or 25 meg, they want higher speeds and they order higher speeds. That's what's happening overseas. What's also happening is the amount of the capacity in gigabytes per month has also been going up quite dramatically. So what we were trying to give is that flexibility. We were trying to make sure that as things progressed, as the demands for speed and capacity progressed, we could meet those, but at the same time reduce the real price of the product for the increased performance. We didn't assume that we could supply somebody with a 1 gigabit per second service at the same price as they get a 12 megabit per service. We would expect them to pay more for that, but there was sometimes an expectation assumed that the speeds and capacities would be never-ending increasing and prices should always go down. Now, you can't pay for a network, any network, by assuming that costs are always going to go down even as speeds and capacities jump dramatically. And I think that's a fundamental issue that's got to be dealt with. The expectation that that prices in for telecommunications has to always go down, because that's what we've seen with ADSL2 when we're building on a kind of a paid off and written down copper network. It's impossible to build a new network without getting, if you want to get a return on it, without having a sensible pricing structure.
It's topical, Mr Quigley. Telstra are calling for a $20 cut in wholesale prices. Other RSPs have made similar noises, both publicly and not so publicly. You might say they would, wouldn't they?
Oh, well, yes.
Do you have a view on price cuts of this
magnitude?
Yeah.
$20 a reduction in $20 in ARPU for NBN Co. I mean, you don't have to be a genius to figure out what a $20 cut in ARPU on a $44 ARPU at the moment would do to the long-term viability of NBN Co. It's an interesting statement. By the way, I should say that back in 2011 or so, the same complaints were made when we introduced the ABC and CVC pricing at that point. And in fact, the $20 per megabit per month for the CVC pricing that we had at that time, Telstra were complaining about, but they had an almost identical product that they sold for wholesale ADSL called AGVC, and for almost exactly the same capacity, they were charging and made a submission to the ACCC for about twice that amount. I think that they were after like $55. So I did in fact raise this with Telstra and they just smiled knowingly, which you'd expect. So it's not surprising that retail telcos will be asking for lower wholesale prices, in the same way as it's not surprising that construction companies will be asking for higher rates for construction. The challenge for NBN Co is to get that right balance so that they're achieving what they need to achieve and still providing the shareholder with a satisfactory return.
I want to talk about the OPEX stuff that you said in your opening statement. These are now no longer just theoreticals, the increased operating costs of multi-technology mix. Has anyone or has anybody been able to cost the differential, the additional cost that is going to be borne by the NBN through OPEX, through the multi-technology mix?
No, I think that's quite difficult. It's very difficult for anybody external to the company to try and do that at this point in time. I think such an exercise could be done. I think in a qualitative sense, there are, I've seen no commentary written by any analysts or by any telcos that would imply that the operating costs of a full fibre network is anything but lower than a copper or a HFC network. Now, the reasons for that are, as I said, are pretty clear. To give you a quantitative account of it now would be very difficult to do. But I expect, by the way, the MTM would have had a substantial impact on the IT costs of NBN Co. Each time you bring in a new technology, you have got to do a lot of work on the IT systems.
And maintenance. To this point, the original NBN business case assumed a cross-subsidy between the loss-making and the non-loss-making area, so you would make substantial profits out of your fixed-line business, which enabled you to cross-subsidise both more remote fixed-line services, your wireless, your satellite services. Given the diminished revenue returns out of your MTM network and the higher operating costs, does this create challenges for that original cross-subsidisation model for regional areas? Yeah,
I think it creates a challenge overall. The ability of NBN Co to fund what are loss-making segments of its business is, if they can't generate a reasonable cash flow overall, they're going to have trouble doing that cross-subsidy. By the way, that cross-subsidy, I think, was the most efficient way to do that. I mean, to hive off the satellite and the fixed wireless and somehow subsidise that a separate way, you lose the flexibility you got with the boundaries. And I think it also makes good sense to have a group of professionals who running a telco business to manage that cross-subsidy inherently in the business model of NBN Co. But I want to be absolutely clear, anybody who talks about selling off the fixed wireless and selling off the satellite business, to privatise that bit of it, they're kidding themselves. The only way that could be done, the only way that somebody would buy that is if there was a guaranteed government subsidy that goes along with it. And I suspect whoever bought it, they'd be focused on the guaranteed government subsidy and how to maximise that, more so on the inherent business itself, except to try and get the cost down.
And the converse is also the case.
Yes.
If you privatise the fixed line network, you are the taxpayer loses a revenue stream
Yes.
to subsidise.
Exactly that. Also, if I can just make one other comment about talking about returns, when I was giving public addresses about the NBN Co, I often had people say to me, "Why are you doing this? Are you getting a commercial return?" The answer was, well, no, we're not getting a commercial return. So why are you doing it? Why would a government do this? And my answer was, because you can't get a commercial return. And that is the reality. This network was being built not for a commercial return, but so that we would have a ubiquitous, broadband, high-capacity, future-proof network.
Thank you.
Right, Dr. Gillespie?
Thanks, Mr. Quigley. Yeah, look, I've followed this closely, both as a constituent before I was in Parliament, eagerly awaiting the rollout of improved broadband. But I apologise, I had to take an urgent call. I ducked out, so I might have missed something. But look, I was really pleased that you complimented the NBN that's kicked a lot of goals at the start and subsequent to you being involved in it. But I'm just querying something that Senator Hume mentioned. Mm-hmm. Was there asbestos problems in all three states where things had ground to a halt with your delivery partners, or was it just in a couple of the Telstra pits?
My recollection was that there were asbestos issues in at least quite a number of states. Now, in NBN Co, we had no choice at that time. Once you find asbestos becomes an issue in a pit, it doesn't really matter where it is, you have to stop the rollout, do an assessment, figure out how you're going to address that. And this was a problem, by the way, of it was not NBN Co's responsibility. Sure. Upgrading those pits was Telstra's responsibility. Well, it was then, it no longer is now, because in the new MGM deal, that responsibility is passed back to NBN Co. But so we had no choice but really to halt things. And it's a real pity. It's a bit like a big production line. Once you stop it, it takes some time to crank it back up again.
Sure. But that aside, don't you think it's a bit ambitious to say that if, given the slow rollout, 4 years and 50,000 customers, surely you would have experienced a ramp up sometime in that 4 years. The figures that I recall, there was about, at the moment, if you went to 1,500 customers or connections a week, it'd take 26 years to reach, 2 million people in Queensland alone. So, I'm just a bit perplexed how you could factor in that exponential ramp up if it hadn't already happened in the first 4 years, asbestos issues aside.
Well, I have here, unfortunately, I can table them afterwards, but you probably can't see them. If you look at the transit network build, it did exactly that. It was flat for a long time, ramped up. The fixed wireless did exactly the same thing. The greenfields, exactly the same thing. And by the way, in the MTM, exactly the same thing happened with FTTN, and even more so with HFC, where they had to put a pause in it to resolve some of the severe issues that they had.
Sure.
It's only just restarted. If you have a look here, I'm not sure you can see it, this is the brownfields, and this is per quarter, the volumes. You can see what happened here. At that point there is when the asbestos problems happened. What happened is they then all stopped, and in fact, NBN Co at that point in time, the new management decided they didn't need to restart FTTP because they were going to do the HFC. Remember, that was going to be the easiest technology. It was going to happen really quite quickly, supposedly. They ran into all sorts of problems. They had to restart the FTTP, and you can see what they did then.
Sure.
So if they'd have kept going on that trajectory, by the way, the whole thing would have been finished easily by 2021. So this isn't hypothetical. This is what was actually done. What they did at this point in time is ramp down, and I'm talking there in like September 2015, they ramped down the FTTP.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah, look,
sorry,
the other...
We're happy to take that on notice. If you could
sure.
provide that to us, that'd be great.
Sure.
Sorry.
Yeah, just, I mean, the rationale for your original proposal to have FTTP pretty much everywhere, except for satellite and fixed wireless areas, was that you could get 100 megabytes per second. But the NBN corporate plan talks about their progression with technology that can be applied over the HFC, over fibre to the basement, over fibre to the curb. In their trials, they're getting 500 megabits per second, and in the HFC upgrade, 10 gigabits per second in a wholesale fashion. The issue being that the technology is always expanding and improving over time, and for that reason, utilising existing trunk lines of either HFC or fibre, you've just got to use what's the best technology at the time. I mean, isn't that why, and can I just seek clarification, the MTM is not peculiar to Australia. It's happened in the UK, it's happened in the US, it's happened in Europe. There are places where they have got fibre to the premise in some areas, but they're usually in the high return areas. I mean, MTM is not unique to Australia. Plenty of places have adopted that. Isn't that the case?
No, I wouldn't say so much they've adopted MTM. What they have used is they've used their existing copper networks. If you're an incumbent telco, of course you're going to use the infrastructure that you've got because it's yours. So that's what they've done with ADSL. Then they moved to VDSL, VDSL2, G.fast.
Yeah.
That makes good sense to do. The question is, when you're starting in 2013, what technology do you choose if you're going to roll out a network? To make a choice to use the old copper network, which you don't have, or the HFC, and I won't say we didn't look at it. I did, in fact, an evaluation together with some of my engineering colleagues of, for example, the Optus HFC network. It took us all of 2 weeks to figure out it was unusable. That was, in fact, advice I gave to the incoming minister in 2013, that this Optus network HFC network is unusable. I think he was quite amused at my position because he had assurances otherwise. As we know, turned out, it was unusable. So it's not a question that you can't upgrade these networks. You can if you pump a lot of money into them. But if you're going to pump a lot of money into them and they're fundamentally limited, you're wasting a lot of money, which is, by the way, when you referred to UK, that's what the Broadband Trends people I quoted in my opening statement said. They said, boy, we've done lots of different technologies. Wouldn't we have been better off if at the beginning we would have backed for FTTP or FTTH and gone with that?
But at the moment, most people who are streaming, I'd say they're the most common users of all that capacity. But I know we've got very slow ADSL2, even in the NBN region, peculiar situation I'm in, surrounded by 3 towers of fixed wireless, close to a town of 50,000 people, but I'm still on ADSL.
Yep.
But we can stream Netflix at home with about 1 or 2 megabytes per second. So, I mean, apart from instantaneously downloading a newspaper or a big document, most people won't ever use that 100 megabytes per second.
Now, this question of what most people will and won't use, as I said earlier, it changes over time. Yeah. Nobody would have believed that the average downloads would now be, as reported by the ABS, 150 megabytes per month, gigabytes per month, or that the NBN is now somewhere between 200 and 250 gigabytes per month, or that people overseas would be demanding speeds of 500 megs and a gig, which they are doing. The reality is technology keeps changing. You may be able to stream a standard definition video on 1.5 megabits per second on an ADSL link, but you'll have real trouble with a 4K video format. And 4K is coming. It's increasing more and more of the videos that are produced are in 4K. In fact, even more so, educational videos and learning material is produced on high definition, very high definition, ultra high definition video format, which you need higher speeds for. Now, we can't predict what's going to be needed in 5 years or 10 years. And frankly, I think it would have been rather astonishing if a company like NBN Co had have said, you're only going to need this speed for the next while. In fact, I was astonished when the Vertigan report produced in 2013 by the incoming government, that cost-benefit analysis, that they came out and said 15 megabits per second is all that the most households will need now into the near future. You tell the average person in Australia they don't need any more than 15 megabits per second, they won't be too happy.
All right, I'm just going to come across to Mr Mitchell and then back to Senator Giorgio.
Thanks, Chair. Mr Quigley, is there anything that you've seen or heard to change your view that a full fibre to the premises to 93% of the population could not have been built for $45 billion?
No.
So that's your position?
I still maintain if you do the numbers, we got a not as big a reduction as Chorus did in New Zealand, and they were doing it on a much lower volume. If we could have even got a kind of half of that reduction that they got, it could have been built for $45 billion in peak funding.
Thank you. Well, that brings me to my next question. In a recent hearing of Senate Estimates, NBN Chair Mr Kwiatkowski, I believe, Ziggy, announced he would generate figures where the market value of the NBN was $50 billion by the early 2020s. Is there any scenario in which the NBN could plausibly be sold for $50 billion, given its multi-technology mix, and you're saying $45 billion for a full fibre? $45
billion in peak funding, yes. Frankly, I think it's probably premature to speculate on what NBN could be sold for, and that will depend on a huge number of factors, including what the competitive situation looks like. Now, I'd say the value of NBN has been limited by the move to MTM because it's not a full fibre network. As I mentioned before, one thing that's going to be very important is the build-out of 5G mobile networks. And if I can also say, let's be under no illusion, both fixed and mobile networks are going to be used. We'll need both of them in the future. You ask any telco how they would feel about the 200 to 250 gigabytes per month that's on the fixed line networks coming across onto the mobile networks, and they'd probably faint because it would cost a fortune to do that over wireless technologies.
I accept the inherent speculative nature of the question, but given a full fibre network could have been built for $45 billion, is it in any way plausible to think that a network with much more limited technology, offering more limited speed and everything else, could be plausibly sold for $5 billion more?
It's potentially possible, in theory, that a network that could be sold for higher value than the assets that it's been used, the funding that's been used to build it, because of a unique position it might be in, because it may be in a monopoly position. There are cases in which people create companies, they put in a certain amount of cash, and they sell it for much more than it's been put in.
Can I put it to you this way, perhaps? Given your experience in the sector, and given everything you've been exposed to, and there's been evidence, or not evidence, but there's been reports of the various industry bodies doing their own analysis of what the NBN Co may be worth. Do you see a scenario where it's plausible that it can be sold for that, given everything that's that's
At
known?
this point in time, and knowing the status of the MTM and the limitations that it's got, I think that would be a challenge.
Senator Giorgio?
Thank you, Chair. I've got an electrical and data background, and I think basically what you're saying, I totally agree with what you're saying today and what you've written in the submission. I think you've hit the nail on the head. But what I would like to know, since Mr. Murrow is leaving, would you be interested in coming back to NBN and fixing the mess?
Actually, I think Mr. Morrow's left and Mr. Rue is now
Mr. Rue,
the CEO.
Take that as a comment.
Yeah.
Mr. Quigley, the one final question, I guess, fibre to the node using copper will represent half of the, the fixed line network. Do you think that it's realistic that form of technology will be able to go unupgraded for any period of time? Is it realistic that delivery using copper for people, sometimes 100 metres from a node, sometimes 500, 600, 700 metres from the node, can that be left as it is, as the sort of the foundation for end users and for the NBN's kind of business model for the next 10 years?
I think probably NBN Co has answered that themselves with their move that they made to fibre to the curb. And by the way, the difference between fibre to the curb and fibre to the node is quite big, because you're actually building the second part of the fibre network. There's a distribution network which goes from the exchange to the node, and then from the node out to the street outside people's homes is the local network, and that's the expensive part of it. But NBN Co are having to do that for their fibre to the curb. So the 1.3, 1.4 million premises that they'll cover with fibre to the curb, they will have had to build out that full fibre network right to the street level. Now, I think what we're going to see is bit by bit the fibre to the nodes, premises that are getting poor performance are going to have to be replaced. Now, you can't just go and replace one premise. You have to do it area by area, which means it is going to be a tricky upgrade. And as they noted in the UK, there's very, very little of the original FTTN investment that's reusable. The cabinets with their power supplies, with all the equipment in it, can't be reused when you move to fibre to the premise.
So you essentially go and you redo it.
You have to redo it. You have to put in the local network. The cabinet becomes kind of scrap at that point in time. So I would say that probably the weakest link in the MTM at the moment is the fibre to the node. And unfortunately, it's the most widespread technology. 4.7 of the close to 11 million premises are going to be served from fibre to the node, which is the technology that is the most limited.
Okay, thank you. It's a depressing note because I know in Western Australia we're getting half as much fibre to the node as anyone else, so I'm depressed even more now. But thank you for your time and your expertise today, Mr. Quigley. That concludes today's hearing. I thank witnesses for appearing, giving evidence today, and committee members for being here on a Friday morning at the end of a long year. Wish everyone a restful and restorative summer break.
Thank you.
Thanks to the Secretary and all the staff.
Thank you.